Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I really do hope you're doing exceedingly well. I'm doing very well, thank you very much, and sending you so much love. Before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink, whatever it is that you drink, tonic water, whether you drink Earl Grey, whatever it is, go and get it because I have a fabulous story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hamish, and I was fortunate and privileged enough to grow up in the resplendent, idyllic countryside of rural Montana, surrounded by visually panoramic, breathtaking views over the exquisite mountainous valleys, canyons, prairies, flowery meadows, silvery lakes, and large clusters of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs sprinkled liberally throughout the countryside, often in ordered rows or clusters. Living in this part of the world does have its distinct disadvantages and drawbacks, because cell phone reception and internet signals can be exceedingly lousy, even in this day and age, which is something that newcomers to our area find exceedingly frustrating. In my experience, the further you live away from town, the more likely you are to face some poor, rugged and badly maintained roads that during the winter months can present all kinds of problems for drivers. The biggest issue, of course, is beyond question the heavy snowfall we get here, as it can be chaotic in this part of the world. And those roads can become exceedingly treacherous as we have no guardrails up, and so you can slide precariously all over the place while you're driving. As a result, we are permitted to drive with studded tyres during the winter months. We also get all kinds of wildlife here, from bears to wolves, elk and mule deer. And if you have chicken or animal feed lying around, you may be encouraging wildlife on your property, most especially bears. And believe me, as lovable as these creatures may be, they can be a huge menace. On one occasion, a bear cleaned me out of a huge bag of dog food meant to last an entire month, that I'd accidentally left outside of my car, and it finished it in less than an hour, which my children at the time found hilariously funny. When my wife Eartha and I got married, we moved to a small, steep, mountainous plot of land, surrounded by a vast backdrop of exquisite rugged outcrops, flowery prairies, and an extensive area of wood green that stretched back for many miles. We lived in an attractive ranch-style home situated at the top of this elevated incline where the ground was flattened out into a sizable luxury turfed yard which was conveniently located 25 minutes away from town. I worked from a workshop on my property, restoring old furniture, for an upmarket company where I made personalised kitchen cabinets to order from select pieces of fine cherry, birch, or special coated or primed woods for the very affluent or over-particular clients who wished to splash out on their homes and required something specialised and out of the ordinary for their kitchens. My incredulous story that ultimately led to my outlandish Bigfoot encounter happened after my kids had long since left home. I was about 55 years old at the time. It would seem that a new resident had bought the next-door neighbour's house and had literally dotted his entire property, which was much like ours, very rugged and mountainous, with hundreds of beat-up, clapped-out old cars and all kinds of ancient, rusty, prehistoric farm machinery that looked like it belonged in an agriculture museum and not in a yard. I have to confess his whole yard was a dreadful excrescence, almost like a bomb had hit the place, and it was a huge defacement or eyesore if you like, yet there wasn't a whole lot I could actually do about it. I did, however, decide to pay him a cordial visit, but by the looks of this disagreeable, obnoxious man, who wore a perpetual scowl on his weathered face, I knew that I was going to have a tumultuous time and invariably be walking on eggshells. I could sense that anything would set him off, much like a spark to a firework, that would ultimately become a volatile, potentially explosive situation that I would do well to avoid, because I didn't want to be on the receiving end of this man's wrath. In truth, it was a little bit like approaching an aggressive dog with caution, very warily watchful that he wasn't going to pounce on me in any given moment. His name was Byron Pepper, and he had those very deep-set, squinty eyes that you could barely see, rather like a bull terrier's, and a rugged, uneven, pitted complexion, and thin lips that were permanently turned upside down into a scowl, that was complemented by a wispy, thin grey beard. The worst part of it all was that this man's size was exceedingly intimidating, for he was built like a huge wrestler, with heavily tattooed muscles on him that were so large that his biceps virtually bubbled, and he was eager to show off his powerful assets, for he wore a scant white string vest and a thick gold chain around his neck. As I approached him, I knew that I would rather be anywhere else right now in the entire world than on his property, for the energy this man exuded was dark and menacing and hardly friendly. I instinctively knew in this instant that we were unlikely to ever be friends. "Who are you?" he barked at me aggressively as I approached him cautiously, with a very evident reluctance that was hard to disguise. "I'm your next-door neighbour," I said, with a tremble in my voice, reaching out cordially to shake his hand, in a gesture of friendliness. He did not take my hand, but eyed me suspiciously. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I just wanted to say hello," I said. "I live next door in the ranch home with my wife Eartha. My name is Hamish." "Hamish," he scoffed. "Ha ha! I knew a man when I was inside that was called that hideous name. Thought he was above everybody else, he did. A big, pretentious snob he was. I brought him down to size after I beat him up very badly. From that moment on, that man learnt some manners, and soon learnt who called the shots." "You were inside?" I asked, looking at him aghast, but trying to suppress my obvious shock. "What for, may I ask?" "For attempted murder, robbery, and assault. But I got out early for good behaviour," he said, almost as if he was boastful of his impressive rap sheet. "Good for you," I said, trying to sound happy for him. "What are you going to do with all these old cars, may I ask? Are they going to be moved soon? Some of them are hanging over the rocky outcrops rather precariously and could potentially fall down in any given moment. I worry that a little wind could cause them to tumble over at any time." "Oh, I see what this is all about," he laughed. "You're worried I'm spoiling your pretty little view. I might have guessed. So this is not really a friendly neighbourly visit after all, is it?" "Well, it is a little bit of a blot on the landscape, you have to admit. Montana is exquisitely beautiful. It seems a pity to spoil the countryside with all these rusty, dilapidated pieces of junk. My wife isn't happy about how unsightly it all looks. It downgrades the whole place, making everything look squalid and unkept." "Get out!" screamed the man. "What I do on my land is my business. How dare you lecture me? If you don't move your posh little butt off my premises, I'll do it for you myself, and that shouldn't be hard, because you're at the very least a little piddling 170 pounds. You don't want to be on the receiving end of one of my punches. Inside, I was not called the Terminator for nothing." After what I can only describe as a pugnacious, belligerent outburst, I quickly scurried away, very hurriedly, like a frightened rabbit, glancing over my shoulders to see the man laughing at me. I was seriously regretting that I'd even bothered to pay him a visit. What was I thinking? When I told my wife about my less than amicable encounter with our warmongering badass neighbour, she wasn't pleased. "He's been in prison for attempted murder," she gasped, looking at me with eyes growing as round as saucers and her jaw dropping to the ground. "You've got to be kidding! What is he doing living next door to us? This is dreadful news. We are living next door to a murderer." "Well, to give him his due, he has served his sentence," I said to my wife, "and it was attempted murder, not murder, and frankly, unless we move, we're pretty much stuck with him. I get the very strong impression that the heaps of junk in that yard are not going anywhere any time soon, I regret to have to say." "We must avoid this truculent, confrontational man like the plague," said my wife. "His sort are not worth messing with. We need to stay out of his way at all costs, for if we get on his wrong side, we could literally end up being buried under his patio and registered as missing people. And I'm not joking about that either. You hear of cases like this every year all around North America. People mysteriously just vanishing without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. We could be next. Please don't talk like that, Eartha, I said. You're scaring me. The man isn't as bad as that, surely. But her foreboding, warning words did send an ominous chill down my spine. I decided to give the local sheriff a call, as I knew him well, and ask him what he knew about the insidious, contentious character, and the news wasn't good. I didn't want to tell you the bad news, Hamish, the sheriff told me, but you are living next door to an objectionable, diabolical character, a nasty piece of work that you don't want to associate with in any way, shape or form. Do you know that man even demanded respect from the prison guards when he was incarcerated, and they were always giving him cigarettes and all the other perks to butter him up, as he was so intimidating and feared by everyone? Tell me something I don't know, I said. The man looks like a fractious thug, and he's easily as hefty as Arnold Schwarzenegger. You've got him in a nutshell, I heard the sheriff saying, pausing on the other end of the phone. For a moment he was silent. Then he said, "What was your impression of him?" He reminds me of a volatile explosive that could go off at any moment. Quite frankly, he scares me, Sheriff, and I'm feeling uneasy living next door to him. I'm not going to lie to you, Sheriff. It's a little bit like living next door to a volcano that could potentially erupt at any given time, and you're not exactly sure when. I feel as if I have to live with one head permanently looking over my shoulder, always watching my back. You're not wrong about that, Hamish. He's an unstable individual that has a temper on him that can flare up at any given moment, which was why he had to attend anger management classes while he was inside to convince the judge that he could return to society. Do you know why he was accused of attempted murder? I asked. Do you really want to know? Asked the sheriff. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Hamish. It could cost you a few nights' sleep. Hell yes, Sheriff. I need to know. Knowledge is power. The more I know, the better. Very well. It's a long story, really. As you can imagine, Byron is not the type to take rejection lying down, which was why when his girlfriend ended their relationship, she quickly went into hiding. She was terrified by how he would react. I understood she really thought he would kill her. I gather a year after she discovered he was in a relationship with a new woman, she came out of hiding, feeling safe, and started to date his cousin. On her part, that was a very foolish thing to do indeed, because it was like rubbing salt into the wound. Byron reacted incredibly badly and became so enraged and belligerent that his cousin was daring to date his girlfriend, so he willfully attempted to murder his cousin. I think he was still secretly fixated on his ex-girlfriend, and the green-eyed monster reared its ugly head. There's nothing like jealousy to bring down a man, and his was insatiable. He ended up beating his cousin up within an inch of his life, but by some miracle his cousin pulled through, even though he very nearly died. It was touch and go for a moment from what I learnt. Not a pretty situation to be in. I gather his ex-girlfriend was finally killed in a very dodgy accident, where it appeared that her brakes had been tampered with, but nothing was ever proved to link the accident to Byron. But my bet is that he was clearly involved in the incident in some way. So not a nice man, whatever way you look at it. How absolutely horrifying, I said. Are you telling me that they've let this monster out of prison? How could they do that? I'm afraid it helps having good lawyers fighting your case for you. Byron had the best legal help on his side, thanks to his wealthy, very devoted mother. And in his eyes, her son can do nothing wrong. She's completely blindsided by him, as he treats her like a queen, and in turn she loves him to death. As you can imagine, I was not happy to learn all the gory inside details about my next-door neighbour. and the more I learnt about him, the less I liked him. But little did I realise that I was going to be seeing a great deal more of him, and the relationship between us would be likely to become increasingly hostile and fraught with tension, if I didn't seriously watch my back, that is. It all began when Byron approached me one morning, all guns blazing, whilst I was in the middle of sanding down a cherrywood kitchen cabinet in my workshop. I glanced over my shoulders to see the furious and irate man storming across the yard towards me, and it was a scary sight to behold, for he was a hefty fellow, and by the livid seething expression upon his face, he could have turned a pot of cold oats into a piping hot breakfast cereal. In short, he looked like he intended to beat me up. "You think it's funny?" he thundered towards me, stamping his feet belligerently on the ground, like a petulant spoilt kid. He positioned himself within a foot from where I was standing, and I could feel my hair standing on edge. Sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about," I said. "Don't pretend you don't know. Someone moved a couple of my cars to the far end of my yard and steamrolled the life out of them, and they're so compressed and ravaged they look as flat as pancakes. I've never seen anything like it before." "I can assure you, Byron," I said, "I didn't do it. How could I move your cars anyway? I haven't got the appropriate machinery to manage such an excavation, and as for pulverising them in the way that you suggest, I wouldn't perform such a vicious stunt on you, and besides, I don't even have a crushing machine at my disposal, and even if I did, it goes against the grain of my character to do something like this to anybody." "But you said yourself you find my yard unsightly." "I know of no one else who has the motive to do this," he said. "Those two cars are now placed in the far end of the yard, where you can't even see them, which is the distinct advantage for you from a visual perspective." "Not really," I said. "You have hundreds of cars out there. What difference does two make to me? But hands on heart, it wasn't me, I can promise you of that." I was heartily glad to see that Byron had significantly calmed down, and his tight clenched jaw softened, and the tension from his face lifted, and his anger dissipated and subsided as quickly as the steam from a kettle. I think he believed that I had nothing to do with the damage to his clapped-out cars after all, which in itself was a monumental relief. "You didn't happen by any chance to make enemies when you were inside," I suggested, trying to throw the ball away from my court as quickly as I could, hoping to divert his angry energy in another direction. At that, Byron stood very still and scratched his black bandana, as if he was going through a mental note of all the people he'd upset in prison, and by the looks of things, he had a sizable collection of disgruntled names to his repertoire. "You're right," he said. "Someone on the inside with a grudge against me did this to me. And come hell or high water, I'm going to find out who the hell it is. I will invest in some game cameras and surreptitiously hide them around my yard where they can't be seen. And when I find out who did this, they're as good as dead." "Not literally," I said, eyeing Byron warily. "I don't speak in riddles," piped Ryan. "You heard what I said. Whoever did this is as good as dead. And when I say dead, I mean a bullet through the temple, quite literally. No one messes with me and gets away with it." Over the next few weeks, strange, rather peculiar things began to happen on Byron's property, of which there was no explanation. It would seem that someone else besides ourselves and the hundreds of rabbits with burrows on his mountainous inclines were also not happy about the cars and dilapidated agricultural equipment lying precariously around the place at random, cluttering up the countryside, as many of these things had been moved, and their flattened, obliterated metal corpses were lying precariously in one huge heap on top of each other, and it looked as if these cars had been placed through a metal crusher. Who or what had the capacity of doing this, I wondered. It gave me the distinct impression that there was order manifesting amidst this dreadful chaos. My wife and I were secretly rather happy that all this junk was being removed so efficiently, as the side windows of the second story of our home that overlooked Byron's property were no longer looking upon a horrendous eyesore. It would seem that he had no choice but to sell off the badly pulverised cars as scrap metal. Someone had discovered all his trail cameras that he had hidden and thrown them down the hilly embankment, and the only pictures he was able to recover revealed something that looked like a hairy large arm or a squirrel, but we couldn't decide what it was, and a few random pictures of wildlife, such as elk and a lone black bear. But otherwise the guilty party who had performed these clever stunts had managed to avoid being caught on camera. It was on a Tuesday morning when Byron came bounding towards my workshop, and I'd never seen the man look so discomposed or rattled before. He reminded me of a lion that you see in a zoo enclosure, pacing up and down restlessly. I had never perceived the man was even capable of being flustered, and he also seemed vulnerable and unusually guarded on this occasion. I watched him playing with his wispy beard awkwardly, and then he piped, "I saw the perpetrator last night. I thought you'd like to know." "Oh, you mean you found the person who's been flattening your cars and throwing them on that huge pile in the back of your yard?" "Yes, that's right." "Well," I said, "was it someone you were incarcerated with by any chance?" I watched Byron twiddling with his beard uncomfortably, and for a moment he looked a little like a frightened boy. Gone was the male bravado of the dangerous, contentious thug that I was well more acquainted with. "It was Bigfoot," he said. "I saw him from my living room window." At that I laughed. "Bigfoot? Now you are having a joke. This is a joke, am I right?" "Do I look like I'm laughing?" said Byron. "No, I'm being serious, deadly serious. And you and I need to kill him together. This is our problem." "Why me?" I asked. "And why is it my problem? What have I got to do with any of this? Why don't you call Fish and Game if you need that kind of help? I am hardly in a position to help you with a Bigfoot. You yourself said that I'm only 170 pounds, and I'm a wimp." Byron began to growl like a vicious dog, and he grabbed me by the back of my collar and drew my head towards him so that his eyes were glaring directly into mine, and he lowered his voice in a husky tone. "You will do as I say, or you'll be sorry. Do you understand, bro?" I nodded, trembling in terror. Now I really was afraid. I didn't want to upset this man, but killing a Bigfoot, a creature that I didn't even believe existed, bordered on the insane. But I shut my mouth quickly and nodded. I wasn't about to argue with this man, as it was more than my life was worth. So there I was at midnight at Byron's house, waiting for a visitor of an unusual kind, a creature until now I had dismissed as belonging to the pages of pulp fiction, but now I wasn't so sure. I had seen an insecurity and capriciousness in Byron that I'd never ever discerned before, as he was a rock-solid dude that did not suffer fools gladly. If his feathers had indeed been ruffled by a Bigfoot, I was more inclined to believe him than to doubt him, for this was a man that did not crumble for no reason at all. I had lied to my wife as I had climbed out of the bed in my PJs after checking my watch. It was 1:45 in the morning, the time that I'd agreed to meet Byron at his house. I told her I was investigating a noise in the backyard that I believed I'd heard, and she pulled the sheets over her head and barely acknowledged me, but mumbled something under her breath, so I knew she'd be fast asleep by now. If she had any clue what I was up to tonight, she would be very aggrieved and distressed. I had surreptitiously piled on several layers of clothes in our ensuite bathroom and crept over to Byron's property on a freezing winter's night, where the icy chill literally permeated through my jacket as the temperatures had dropped quite considerably overnight, and there was an icy wind that was blowing against my face. It certainly wasn't pleasant to be up at this time of the morning. I was wearing a headlamp, which was not a necessity, as the ivory moon was almost full, and the floodlights in Byron's property, which he had left on all night, offered enough illumination to see my way very clearly. Byron handed me a high-powered rifle and asked me if I knew how to use it. I nodded. "Good," he said, as he loaded his rifle. "When I say go, we will unload our bullets into the critter. Understand?" I nodded again. not feeling very confident about anything, and I knew I was not the best of a shot either, but I wasn't eager to allow Byron to know about any of my shortcomings. Byron beckoned for me to follow him, and we surreptitiously crawled behind the heap of flattened cars, which were the most recent victims of the Bigfoot's pliable and crushing hands that had made light work of all this metal. "He's coming," whispered Byron. "Keep very still." All of a sudden I could hear this very loud rattling sound in his yard, and then the sound of metal being twisted, macerated, mangled and pulverized, rather like the sound you hear when a car crashes into something with brute force, like a tree or something like that. It wasn't long before I could hear hefty footfall walking across the yard. I could sense and feel a very powerful presence moving towards the pile of scrap where we were both hiding behind. I could hear the critter breathing, and he sounded exactly like a horse, and appeared to be grunting in a way that made him sound as if he was a little fed up. By this time Byron was breathing heavily, and his forehead was sweating profusely as the water poured down his face like droplets of rain, and he was shaking as he was holding his rifle in his hand that was literally slipping in his fingers as they were so wet. The man looked utterly petrified, rather reminding me of a rabbit being pursued by a fox, but his focus was still impressive. I was stunned to see a man the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the so-called Terminator, reduced to this ridiculous state. I was really too bewildered to react to this enigmatic situation that was unfolding before me. Then I saw him, the dark, shadowy, ghostly silhouette gliding towards us that almost looked demonical and was so incongruous to our reality that for a moment I questioned what I was actually perceiving. Never in all my born days have I seen anything so monstrously big. The creature was easily 10 foot tall, 3 feet wide across the shoulder area, and 900 pounds, and was covered with 4-inch long dark hair. The critter had a pyramid-shaped head and a very human face. In its overlong arms he was carrying the remains of a battered car that looked like a squashed-up metal surfboard. I could see the creature rather clearly through the beams of the soft moonlight that dappled the Bigfoot in a shower of radiance. This colossal Bigfoot was standing only yards away from us, and he began to sniff the air, as if he could smell something quite repugnant and very offensive to him, and I realized with horror that he was smelling us. It would seem that he found our body odour to be objectionable and abhorrent. Surely we didn't smell that bad, I thought. I knew Bigfoots are supposed to stink to high heaven, and I wish I could tell you that I smelt the sulphurous, odious compounds they speak about on television programmes when accounting for the presence of a Bigfoot, but all I could smell was a sweet, refreshing, minty scent of pine. "Get ready to fire," whispered Byron, "and let's aim for the head." Byron's words faded as my heart began to pound like a heavy drum, and I became so anxious that my fingers were shaking on the trigger, and my hands became clammy and wet, and I was immobilized with terror. I didn't want to shoot at anything, especially something that looked like a man, covered in hair, only gigantic in his proportions, and there was nothing in this creature's demeanour that made me think it was fair to kill him at all. "Get ready to shoot now," whispered Byron. I could hear Byron unload his bullets at the critter, but it had moved away from the line of fire like greased lightning, and was now standing directly behind Byron, studying him curiously through deep-set dark eyes that in certain lights glittered with a red eye-shine. How could anything have moved so fast, I wondered? This monstrous beast moved towards Byron and curled back his lips and began to growl, displaying an enormous jaw of glistening, oversized human teeth, and the sound he made was the most hostile, aggressive sound that I've ever heard, that would truly make a lion's growl sound like a tame, very friendly pussycat. The Bigfoot lunged boldly towards Byron and pulled the rifle from his hands, twisting it in half and throwing it on the pile of scrap with the rest of the cars. "Kill him!" screamed Byron to me. "Now, you idiot! Get on with it!" I trembled, my wet hand sliding on the trigger, but I was completely unable to shoot. I was too afraid to do anything, but before I could align my thoughts, the creature had grabbed my rifle from me, and bent it in half and thrown it on the scrap heap, along with Byron's weapon. Now we were rarely at the creature's mercy, and I was pretty certain we were as good as dead. "Idiot!" screamed Byron. "Now we're both dead!" The critter grabbed Byron in his overlong arms, throwing him over his shoulders like a huge sack of potatoes, while Byron was cursing, kicking and screaming. I watched the scene unfold before me in horror. It was like watching a movie in slow motion. This was my opportunity to escape. "Move!" my mind shouted to me. "Move! Get out of there now!" But I remained frozen by terror, unable to move even a muscle of mine. What the hell was wrong with me? Why was my body failing to cooperate with my mind? I could see the Bigfoot toss Byron in the air like a huge beach ball, and I heard a loud splash and realised that he'd thrown Byron into the swimming pool. In what seemed like seconds, I was now flung over the creature's gargantuan shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and everything happened so fast as the creature moved at the speed of greased lightning, and I didn't have time even to collect my thoughts or consider what was happening. All of a sudden I was tossed up into the air at about 10 feet off the ground, and I started to descend into the depths of the water like a heavy rock. I was suddenly submerged in the ice cold, and it was a huge shock to my system. As my head reached the surface, I began oscillating my arms in a desperate, confused panic and taking very sharp, quick breaths. I could see the critter gliding away to the rear of the property towards the wood green, never glancing back at us once. Byron, who'd only just got out of the swimming pool, quickly helped me out of the water, and we both began to tear our clothes off as the icy cold was making us shiver and shake because it was a bitterly cold night. "Come inside," Byron ordered, and I obediently followed him, and the two of us stood naked by the flames of a huge open fire that was crackling away in the living room. We were like two bags of frozen peas defrosting, and were shivering and trembling. Our jaws were chattering. I do not remember a time in my life that I felt more cold. Neither of us said a single word, and Byron fetched a couple of blankets, which we swathed over our bodies, and finally, when we had enough energy, he made us both steaming cups of hot chocolate, and nothing felt so good as the taste of that rich, sweet drink that warmed my entire body. Even after that hot, delicious drink, we both sat there just staring at the flames in a hypnotized state, neither of us saying a single word for possibly a couple of hours, as we were both in a state of suspended shock. "Sorry, bro," said Byron, suddenly breaking the long drawn-out silence that caused me to snap out of my trance. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this. You really were no match for that creature. Did you see the size of the thing?" I nodded, trembling. "He could have killed us both." "You're not wrong about that, bro," said Brian, "but thankfully he didn't harm us. But I see now that I was no match for that thing. Look at the size of me next to him. I felt like a feather. We got off lightly this time, but next time we might not be so lucky." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Are you going to finally call fish and game?" "Fish and game?" laughed Byron. "Are you for real? If they send someone out, that creature will have their guts for garters. If I can't take him down, no one can." "I see what you mean," I said. "You are very big, but next to him, you did look tiny and inconspicuous, I have to admit." "My point exactly," said Byron. "So what are you going to do?" I asked. "Sell up," said Byron, "and move somewhere safer than this. And you would be wise to do the same." I breathed a huge sigh of relief. If Byron was selling, things were already looking up, I thought privately to myself. I wasn't concerned about the Bigfoot, because if he really wanted us dead, he would have killed us already, and yet he hadn't. To cut a long story short, Byron did sell his property next door, and I'm glad to say that our new neighbours did not litter the land with hundreds of clapped-out old cars like their predecessor had done. For a long time I wondered why the Bigfoot took such offence to Byron's backyard being littered by so many cars, but one day on examining his land, I believe I found the answer. On the far side of his property is a large rugged outcrop, which from a 6-foot elevation appears to open up into a cave. I climbed up there once in a moment of curiosity, and I could see there were long wide passages that led from the cave through the mountain, and I believe they open up somewhere into the wood green. But I was too nervous to go exploring them myself, but it was a hidden access point from the woods to the neighbour's yard, and a perfect shelter from cold weather or rainy conditions. I also noticed very distinguished markers around my neighbour's property, where trees had been deliberately snapped, and long thin branches scantily arranged in very particular ways that gave me the impression that these were Bigfoot signs laying claim to the land. I think the Bigfoot viewed Byron's property that branches out to an extensive area of wood green at its rear as all his territory. The property was very sloped with hilly banks that were like large steps that led up to the flattened area where the house was located, and it was just chock-a-block filled with hundreds of rabbit burrows which had been blocked off by many of those crumbled cars, which was a potential food source for the Bigfoots, and in some way it was almost like he was managing that warren like a farmer manages his chickens or cows. So I think this Bigfoot was tidying the place up in order to keep the rabbits all happy and their burrows easily accessible. Of course, I could be very wrong about this, but that is what I discerned and perceived. One day, 10 years after this extraordinary incident, I happened to stumble into this lean man in the supermarket, and to my amazement it was Byron, and the man was half his original size. I could hardly believe it. I barely recognised him. He was wheeling an old woman in a wheelchair through the store, who wore a happy smile on her wizened face, and was very elegant and well attired, wearing a cashmere sweater and a little necklace of pearls. "Mother," he said to the woman, "this is my ex-neighbour, Hamish." "Oh, I heard all about you," she chuckled, "and the problems you had with Bigfoot." I smiled at the woman awkwardly. "She knows all about our fiasco with the critter," Byron laughed. "I've told Mother absolutely everything about that night when we dried ourselves by the fire naked. Have you happened to see any more of the big creature?" "No, I can't say I've actually seen anything," I said. "The neighbour who bought your house does tend to find large footsteps from time to time, and gets quite excited about it because he does believe it's Bigfoot. One time he did find a pile of dead rabbits held together with twine that were quickly gone." "So he's still around then," chuckled Byron. "I'm glad I'm out of there. I'm not going to kid. That thing was a monster." "If he wanted you dead, son," said the woman, "he would have killed you then and there. But he didn't, so he can't be that bad." "You're right about that," I admitted. "I often think about that. He could so easily have killed us, especially after you shot at him so many rounds. He would have been in his right to do so." "Are you still collecting cars?" I asked Byron. "Are you kidding?" he laughed. "I've got a full-time job looking after my mother. I haven't got time for that, or the gym. Look at me. I'm half the size that I used to be." Byron's mother laughed. "And I'm so lucky to have Byron looking after me. I couldn't be in better hands," she said. "I can see that," I said, smiling, as I bid them both farewell, getting into my car and reflecting on the night that I was thrown into the pool by a Bigfoot, something that I will never ever forget in a hurry. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that was a fabulous story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, goodbye and good night.